I don't know about you, but the way I see it, if I'm going to be a person of faith at all, I want it to be genuine, authentic, or not at all. So I, like Thomas the disciple, I don't think it's fair to call him Doubting Thomas, a nickname which is not, I hope you know, in the Bible. He's just intellectually honest, as we all need to be. I don't think there's anything to be gained from casting him and judging him in a negative light. And since you've heard me preach at least twice on the story from John 20, where Thomas finally sees the risen Jesus, I'm thrilled that this year the lectionary suggests that we read the story not in a negative light, but in the positive light of faith. We're asked to read this story in light of 1 Peter chapter 1, 3 through 9, which says that this resurrection that we have just observed has given us, quote, a new birth into a living hope, that while our faith is perishable, when it is tested, as it was for Thomas, the result is a genuine faith. Isn't that good news? When our faith is tested, when we suffer with grief and with guilt, with emotional despair, with intellectual doubt, as Thomas did, the result is a more genuine faith, an inheritance that is imperishable, undefiled, and unfading, and more precious than gold. If I'm going to be a person of faith at all, I want it to be like that. So if you need a sermon about doubt this morning, I'll be happy to pull out an old sermon to send you home with. But let's look instead to see what this story can tell us about how faith becomes genuine. We Americans play pretty fast and loose with that word. Remember the Corinthian leather that Ricardo Montalban promised us if we bought a Chrysler Cordoba? Can I see hands? Yeah. Not from Corinth, not all leather. I know. And when the Superman movie Man of Steel came out, there were some changes from the original images that we had. Superman was no longer, for example, wearing his bright red underwear outside his clothes. I don't know how he got away with doing that in the first place. But when they showed this new Superman, comic book fans got really upset. And the screenplay writer was quoted as saying in his defense, and listen carefully, he said, well, we wanted to show a more realistic Superman. Which has to be one of the most bizarre sentences in the history of the English language. A lot of our religion is fake too. I used to work in the Christian music publishing industry that served Christian radio and TV. It's a subculture of Christianity that is the love child of evangelicalism and Madison Avenue. And it works to profit from manufacturing Christian celebrity and products that are, through the magic of branding, made holier than other products by being labeled so. In their world, as in Hollywood, beauty and wealth are honored like virtues. But unlike Hollywood, where scandal is celebrated, in Christian media, people who are discovered to have human failings are unceremoniously disavowed as a threat to the image on the brand. So real people need not apply. That marketing has had its effect on local churches around our country, which have followed suit by producing glossy ads, billboards, and websites that use photos of not real church members, but models posing like in outdoor vacation settings. And maybe it's just a coincidence, but in the 2 decades that I traveled from church to church visiting, the models in the pictures never showed up to church on the Sundays I was there. They all looked like regular people. Another reason I never felt that I fit in there was that I never learned to speak Christianese. You know, when something good would happen, people around me would say, "Go God," like God was a draft pick on their fantasy football team. And whenever they said they were too blessed to be stressed or too anointed to be disappointed, I always felt that it was a backhanded way of saying that the stresses and disappointments in my life were a sign of my spiritual inferiority. So I didn't go around talking much about my true feelings. One thing you can't miss in the story about Thomas is that authentic faith is faith that has been wounded by real life. Thomas's faith is battered by grief, by being left out, by his shame about his doubt. And here is Jesus, who has been wounded to death. Of course, as people who've watched as much TV and movies as we have, we could have explained to the writer of John that this is not how the story should be told. This hero Jesus is supposed to reappear like a ghostly Obi-Wan Kenobi, glowing with a brilliant light, fully restored. If you reach for him, your hand should pass right through him. He should be present but distant. He should be himself but better and more powerful, with a new, fully healed, beautiful body, clearly one without open wounds. A lot of people I have talked to in my life are so eager to get to heaven, but not for Jesus, but as much for they want to get to heaven for the chance to sport a new body. They've heard that's part of the deal. And I've talked to some people who, if they get to heaven and discover that they're not going to get to look like Ryan Gosling or Emma Stone, they may not really be interested in the rest. But this perfected new body is not the way John describes the resurrection. When Jesus appears, his scars are the first thing they notice. We can interpret this revealing of the wounds as simply proof of a resurrection miracle. But for the disciples, the marks are signs of his authenticity. They are proof of his identity. They are signs that they can trust what they see. If this story is only about Jesus providing proof of a miracle, then the only thing to say about it is, wow, a miracle. But if it's a story about a God who enters our pain to invite us to enter God's pain, well, that's a different definition of authentic faith. And if we go and do likewise, it will produce a different kind of Christian. We can get so hung up on belief. But Jesus presents his wounds not as a new doctrine to be believed, but as a shocking invitation to a new level of intimacy. He comes to them in response to the terrible sense of separation they are feeling in their grief. He knows that empathy is what we most need from God and what we most need from one another. We work so hard to cover our scars for appearance's sake. Many of us teeter on the edge of exhaustion from just trying to keep people from knowing the truth about our pain. As if by not acknowledging it, there might be some sense in which it isn't real. But the truth is, if you start looking for scars, you will start to see them all over creation. I went hiking in Jones Gap last Saturday. Every tree in the forest is scarred. All those beautiful trees. They each bear a unique wound. As I watched the morning news over breakfast on Friday, in the space of 30 seconds, I saw a story about how 80% of the manatees in Florida are covered with scars from boat strikes. And in the very next story, the deeply scarred royal family of Great Britain were sitting at a wooden picnic table, talking candidly about their still fresh grief over the death of their mother 20 years ago, and the further wounds they have experienced because of the lousy advice they were given about, don't talk about it, that won't bring her back. If 80% of the manatees are wounded, then among us humans, the percentage is closer to 100%. And it is our prideful insistence on denying and hiding pain that gives our wounds. But being honest about it will help us accept the fact that our scars make us who we are. They are signs to other people that we are human and we know it, that we've been there, that we can be trusted to empathize and not to judge. They are signs that it's safe to come close. Susan and I were on hand Thursday night to see Tony McDade awarded the Atlantic Institute's Public and Community Service Award. Richly deserved recognition for him and for United Ministries. The event was emceed by a woman named Martell from the Sheriff's Department. I've forgotten her last name and need to find it. She closed the evening by saying that from her vantage point in the Sheriff's Department, whenever there is a gap in communication, distance between people, our worst fears and instincts rush in to fill that void. Where there's no dialogue to provide mutual understanding and reassurance, our own pain and our anger and our stereotypes and our prejudices, they rush in to fill the gap. And all it takes is a crisis to light the spark that leads to violence, that leads to all the things that we fight and grieve in society. She said that only by filling the space with honest dialogue can we prevent the kind of problems that keep the Sheriff's Department so busy. But Jesus goes even further than that. The invitation to touch a wound is to invite someone into a relationship where nothing can come between you. This gives a whole new meaning to intimacy. And perhaps that's why this happened behind closed doors. Authentic faith is shared interpersonally and stops being authentic when it is treated like a marketing campaign or a political campaign. This is lost on people who think it's their job to save the world. It's one of the things that Judas never understood or refused to accept. Just a few chapters before this event in the Gospel of John, he is the one who says, "But Lord, why do you intend to show yourself to us and not to the world?" Judas might have been happier in the 19th or 20th centuries when it was thought that the gospel just didn't have a chance of reaching the world unless it was broadcast to millions and Bibles could be sold in the millions and all churches could become mega churches. It's interesting that Jesus doesn't seem to believe that. He said that authentic faith prays in secret. And it gives without the right hand knowing what the left hand is doing. He revealed his identity as Messiah and his resurrection to people, to individual people, in private conversations. Public campaigns depend on propaganda, but relationships of trust are forged one to one. Public appearances are by nature a kind of performance. But wounds are shared privately. So God revealed the risen Christ in the solitude of a graveyard at dawn to a lone woman whose testimony would have no standing in court. And none of that has kept Christianity from spreading. That door in Jerusalem was locked, and yet here we sit on another continent 2,000 years ago claiming that faith as our own. With apologies to the musical Hamilton, we do not have to be in the room where it happened. Sharing faith interpersonally does not mean that the world never gets to hear. It just means that the world gets to hear about it in a personal and authentic way, with a personal touch, as Jesus shared it. So authentic faith is wounded by real life, it is shared between real people, and it is integrated with real life. It's like a sewing needle that comes out of real life, is shared in relationships, and is woven back into real life. That is what God has done in the life of Christ, generally speaking. The Christ event was God's baptism in the human experience, God's identification with us, and all the things that we go through. The marred body of Jesus tells the story of a crucifixion, but it also tells the story of a lifetime of wounds from his human experience. The marks around his head, he might tell us, were like the vicissitudes of life, the little slights and private agonies that are never fatal unless there are too many of them, but always painful and always leave a mark. The scar in his left foot, he might tell us, was from losing his father Joseph at a young age. The right scar from the harrowing rejection of his beloved hometown. The nail scar in his left hand might have been made by the betrayal of Judas. The right hand scar, the denials of Peter. The wound in his side, he might tell us, was the stabbing pain of being cursed by what seemed like the whole world when they cried, "Crucify him." And he might tell us there are scars, still more scars, that don't even show, like the wound in his heart from feeling forsaken by God. The wounds that mar the body of Christ are the signs of how intimately he knows us. And they are the scars by which we recognize him. All the injuries of life are there. And now that we are the body of Christ, they are all here, in this room. The physical pain is here. The rejection and the grief are here. The victimization and the neglect and the despair and the wounded feeling that even God has turned away, they are all here. And if we hide them, we simply rob ourselves of the comfort of recognizing our experience in someone else's life. We keep ourselves from the communion of empathy. But when we share ourselves, we discover again how the prophet could say, "By his wounds we are healed," 1,000 years before Jesus ever came. It is eternally true. And if we will share them, we finally become the witnesses Jesus told his disciples they would be. As it was with foot washing and with the serving, the lesson of revealing his scars came with the implied command to go and do likewise. Last April, in the Fayetteville Observer, I read this story. North Carolina District Court Judge Lou Oliveira, who is a veteran of the Gulf War as well as a veteran of the judicial bench, presides over a treatment court for veterans with mental health issues in Cumberland County, North Carolina. When Sergeant Joseph Cerna came before the bench for violating a condition of parole that required him to abstain from alcohol, he was no stranger to Judge Oliveira. The judge knew that Cerna had served 4 tours in Afghanistan, nearly dying several times, collecting 3 Purple Hearts and other accolades, and seeing many of his friends die. Like many veterans, he knew that Cerna was having difficulty leaving the war behind, and that he struggled with alcoholism. Judge Oliveira sentenced Cerna to a night in prison, but concerned that the experience might trigger Cerna's PTSD, the judge drove his fellow veteran to a jail in Lumberton himself and persuaded the jailer, who was a fellow veteran and friend, to let him serve the sentence with him. The 2 men spent most of the evening sitting on a single bunk in the single cell, talking about their experiences in the war. And later, Cerna said, "I can't even put into words how I feel about him. I've seen a lot of things, but this is by far the most compassionate thing I've ever seen anyone give to anybody. I will never let him down again." That's the real deal. Speaking Christianese never helped anybody. Believing hard to believe stuff, that doesn't make us faithful. It just makes us gullible. but touching the wounds that mar the body of Christ, allowing others to touch the pain in us, that changes everything. It creates shelter. It gives birth to trust. It expresses a faith so genuine that even the most cynical of doubters can recognize the risen Christ standing in our midst.